Good morning, Mr. Opasi. This is my second Io practice for English SL. So the global issue I chose for this IO was violence. Violence is a behavior that is intended to hurt or kill somebody. This is the meaning that is generally known about violence. So I narrowed down my global issue a bit to violence to people of lower power. People of lower power meaning that rich beating up the poor, like strong beating up the weak, all of these kinds of power. So the example that I chose for my literary excerpt was from Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. So the violence towards lower or people of lower powers demonstrated through the main character Okonwo, and him beating up his wife, kids, and all of these examples, which should be stated later on in the video. And the example I chose for my non-literary excerpt was Slumdog Millionaire, which is a movie we watched in class a year ago. I used all of the movie as my non-literary excerpt and chose the most significant scenes where violence towards lower people was shown. I chose that because it is shown to the society and how there is a gap between the rich and the poor, but all of that will still be explained later on in the video. Now I'll proceed to the first couple of examples from my literary excerpt, Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. The first quote states, Okonkwo was provoked to justifiable anger by his younger wife when to plait her hair. Achebe, 20. Okonkwo got so angry over his wife for just plaiting her, which is something small, and getting angry over someone is an act of violence because it technically hurts someone, if not physically, mentally. Here the global issue of people of high power being violent to people of lower power is shown because in Things Fall Apart, men hold more status than women, and Okonkwo got mad over his wife, and his wife is a woman. So Okonkwo is showing acts of violence towards people of lower power, which is in this case his wife. This quote has a significant impact on our thoughts of the future or the events that will happen later on in the book, because it shows us that Okonkwo is a violent character and maybe has some traits of toxic masculinity and thinks that everyone should be violent and that violence is the only answer. So this gives us an idea of the things and actions that Okonkwo might take as we read the book. A rhetorical device that I see being used is an anecdote. An anecdote is a narrative detailing the particulars of an event. In this case, it is detailing the particulars of when Okonkwo got mad over his wife for plaiting her hair. So this was my first example. So the second example I chose from Things Fall Apart was a quote also. This quote stated, "And when she returned, he beat her very heavily. In his anger, he had forgotten that it was the week of peace." So this is also page 20 of Things Fall Apart, Chinua Achebe. So first of all, Okonkwo beating his wife, which is of lower power, shows violence, and that later on connects to our global issue, which is violence to people of lower power. So Okonkwo beats his wife, which is of lower power, and that is why I chose this quote, and that is why this quote is relevant to the global issue. So the fact that there is a thing called the week of peace in the society of Things Fall Apart shows that violence is in the hearts of the villagers, and that violence has always been there, and it's something that they are used to, maybe excessively, and that was why they created the week of peace. So this foreshadows some incidents that might happen later on in the future, and which makes us readers think about these incidents and how they might be introduced to us. Maybe Okonkwo can get mad over something so stupid, which might foreshadow or lead to his exile or punishment. So this foreshadows incidents which might lead to Okonkwo's punishment or exile. And a rhetorical device that I see being used here is an anti-hero. An anti-hero is a protagonist which is mostly inept, graceless, dishonest, stupid. And in this case, we see that Okonkwo is an anti-hero. The third example I chose from my literary excerpt was, but Okonkwo was not the man to stop beating somebody halfway through, not even for the fear of the goddess. So this quote is actually from page 20. It shows to what extent Okonkwo can be violent and how violence is in the hearts of the Umufian clan. Here, It shows how violence is controlling the main character and circulating around him throughout the story, and how violent Okonkwo can be, and the fact that he fears the goddess but still commits these acts of violence shows how violence is circulating around him and how violent he'll be throughout the story. Because even though he fears his goddess, he's still violent. And the rhetorical device that I found here was satire, which is the use of irony, exaggeration, and all of that to show the stupidity of the person. And here, the fear of Okonkwo to the goddess and him still committing violence shows how stupid he is, and how his crime that he committed was unnecessary, especially during the week of peace, and how big it is for him to be fearing the gods and still do it. Like, even though the god is something big and he should fear the goddess, but the fact that he's still that violent when he fears the goddess shows how violent he truly is. Now I'll proceed to read or give the examples of my non-literary excerpt, which is Slumdog Millionaire. So the first excerpt or part I chose from the non-literary text was when Jamal was being tortured because he had won the prize. First of all, I chose this part because it relates to the global issue. Because first of all, torture is a form of violence and an act intended to hurt someone, and he was tortured by an organization which clearly holds more power, especially in India, because an organization might be rich, so it holds more power than Jamal, who's a poor man. So that is why I chose this quote, because it shows violence from stronger people to people of lower power. This part shows us why Jamal is being targeted, and shows us what might happen later in the story from acts of violence, and how big the sum of money Jamal won is for him to be tortured because he won. It shows us how big it might be. It foreshadows how big it might be. So the way Jamal is tortured sets the tone for the movie and gives us this feeling that we will see a lot of violence during the events of the movie as we proceed to watch the movie. So this was a scene that set the tone for the movie, and that was the rhetorical device or literary device I used for this example. So the second example I chose from Slumdog Millionaire was when the kidnappers were beating up the kids and ended up blinding kid. So first of all, kidnapping kids is a form of violence which is known throughout the world and it doesn't need explanation. But the kidnappers were torturing a kid and spilled something on his eyes and ended up blinding him, which is a form of violence because these kidnappers are grown men and clearly hold more power, even if not socially but physically, than the younger kids. So that is a form of violence from people of more power to less power. So when this scene was displayed, all of the kids were separated after that, which foreshadows that there might be a reunion, this affects the rest of the story and gives us insight on what might happen later in the story, especially because we know that Jamal and Latika love each other, so this foreshadows that they might end up being with each other as partners. The third example I chose from my non-literary excerpt was when a woman was threatened and her face was scarred by a knife. So slicing one's face, of course, is a form of violence, and especially slicing a woman's face is a form of violence of people of lower class, which are men, of course. Slicing a woman's face, which is of lower power, because men are usually more stronger than women, so that is a form of violence towards people of lower power. So this quote or this piece of the movie scene of the movie shows how violent the work is and the types of violence that will be included in the non-literary work as we proceed this story. So this created a symbol in my head, which is a scar, and a scar is of course associated with a form of violence, or 80% a source of from violent acts, because there are also 20% which might be regular accidents, but most of the time a scar is from violent acts. And the symbol that was created in my head was a scar, and the scar made me imagine some bloody images, which is also associated with violence most of the time. So this was the third example from my non-literary excerpt. To conclude my I.O., both texts show different forms of violence, they show that violence can be an issue. They show how violence can actually be an issue in our society and how it affects people negatively. So the literary text, which is Things Fall Apart, shows how violence can be derived from past fears and insecurities, which is presented in the form of Okonkwo being scared of his father's past and therefore being violent to cancel out his insecurities. And it is also shown and violence is also shown in the non-literary excerpt by how violence is all around us in our current society, but we just don't notice it because we live in a level where most of the people who are treated violently are just under us, so we don't usually focus, but it shows us how these people are actually affected and how violence is everywhere. So both texts contradict each other in the way violence is shown, but overall they're closely related because they show us how there can actually be violence towards people of lower power. Thanks for watching.